Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ashley Tarigliato. You don't have to remember that last part. You can all just call me Ashley. I am the new membership manager here at the St. Louis Science Center. So I just wanted to say hello. You will be seeing my face hopefully much more often. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming out tonight. I want to also introduce Kristina Hampton. Kristina has curated this amazing collection for us. So I want to give her a round of applause in advance because she's amazing. But again, thank you all so much for being members, for being here with us. We hope you'll come back out for our holiday member night on December 7th. Thank you. I always want to say something else, but it is the 7th. So we hope to see you then and enjoy the program.
So thank you guys for coming out tonight. I recognize some of you. Those of you who've been to this last year, but also who've been on tours with me before. So you guys know a little bit about what you're in for, but maybe some of the rest of you do not. So the Science Center has a collection of over 100,000 artifacts and specimens. And so as you can imagine, there's a variety of different things and some very creepy things as well, which is perfect for Halloween. Did anybody notice the artifact of the month upstairs? Yeah, with his mouth open. Yeah, that fun model. Yeah, anybody see that? Take a look on your way out. It also is creepy. Yeah. All right, so this tour is going to highlight some of those creepy objects from our medical collection. So how do you choose what to show? There's so many objects in our collection that'll make you squirm, shiver, or just gasp in terror. I've tried to show some objects to some that I think you will enjoy that are creepy and also have a good story, because one of the things about me is I'm a storyteller, and all of these artifacts have a story. So we get to share those with you tonight, and hopefully you'll find it interesting and creepy. Yes. So here's what you can expect tonight. We will present the artifacts here on stage, and then we realize that you won't be able to see since you're not real close, but we have some help for that. So my delightful assistant, Dave, is going to have the camera tonight and get some, oh, thank you, yay, Dave. So he's going to get some close-ups with the camera, so make sure you pay attention to your screens. And then Kalia will also point out some artifacts that we're talking about at the time and even demonstrate some of them for you. So at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for question and answer. And then after that, we're going to bring all of the objects up to the end of the stage. And so then you guys can come up near the stage and just take a closer look. Then if you have any questions at that time too, totally fine. We'll be here for that. All right. So as I mentioned, we're going to be exploring those medical objects tonight. And when talking about tools used on the human body, it can get pretty gruesome, right? Yeah? All right, so you were all cautioned before signing up for this. So you should be aware already that there is some disturbing information and potentially images. So hopefully you took that seriously. All right. So to start off with, we're gonna go a little bit easy, just kind of ease our way into this first with something maybe not quite so terrifying. Anybody like the dentist? No. Oh, you're like the only one. Why? Look at this. Like, why? Oh, yeah. I'm not a fan. It seems like many of us are not. But did you know that the world's first dental school wasn't founded until 1840? So that's not terribly long ago. So dental education was not even a thing until the 19th century. So by 1866, there were only 6 dental schools in the US and only 1 west of the Mississippi River, right here in St. Louis, the Missouri Dental College. So what did people do before there were dentists? Or before there were any close enough that they could visit? That's also a problem. So until after the Civil War, most people sought very basic dental care from their physician, and that usually meant pulling out your teeth. So that was your dental care that you could look forward to. Some brave or possibly very, very stupid individuals tried self-care. Maybe because there was no other option and they had to, but I would not recommend. And then people might also visit the barber surgeon, who could also pull your tooth. Now, he was just this full-service gig, so you could go and get a haircut, you could get your tooth pulled, you can get an amputation or get a bone set, you can even get some bloodletting if you're feeling a little bit under the weather. So he was quite the one to visit, although I'd make sure he knew what he was doing before he started, right? Yeah. But whichever dentist that you decided to visit, they would use this tool. So these are called dental keys, also called tooth keys. So from the 19th century. Dental keys were introduced in the early 1700s and became the tool of choice for pulling teeth after 1770. Has anyone ever tried to pull out a loose tooth? Yes. Doesn't feel awesome, does it? Can you imagine what it feels like to have one pulled that's fully rooted in place? Yeah, that's what this guy was for. So dental keys were originally modeled after a door key, which is how they get their name. And early versions like this one actually looked like a door key, but how do they work? So the dental key was inserted into the mouth horizontally. The claw was then tightened over the tooth, rotated, and pulled. That's it. Extremely painful, and the patient probably had to be restrained. When you consider that this tool could break teeth, extract nearby teeth, cause the jaw to fracture, and cause soft tissue damage, it's a wonder that they were still used until the late 1800s. Unfortunately, they really didn't have a choice. Because there were no other options until forceps were introduced in the 1870s. So as dentistry began to professionalize, dentists started creating specialized tools like forceps and moving away from these more crude, painful tools, like the dental key. Thank goodness. So another example of the specialized tool we have is the Bonwell electromagnetic mallet. So what is that? Nicknamed a dental plugger, this guy was used to plug your tooth cavities with gold. So this was basically the tool that would give you a filling. It was patented in 1873, and this was the first dental device to use electricity, and it was intended to improve the process of getting your fillings hammered in place. So it uses electromagnetic coils in the battery there, and to generate that hammering motion, and provides continuous and precise hitting to apply that gold filler. So the instrument is credited as the first electrically operated handheld tool. Does this maybe look a little familiar to anybody? Oh, interesting that you say that. This tool inspired Samuel O'Reilly, the inventor of the electric tattoo machine. He adapted a dental plugger to create his first tattoo machine, achieving the desired continuous and precise hammering motion to improve the tattooing process. So you can thank everyone who wanted a different thing to plug their teeth for that. Yay! So if we're going to be talking about dentistry, then we really should talk about an important tool used in dentistry as well as in other medical areas. The mouth gag. Mouth gags, or mouth props, are those surgical devices placed between the upper and the lower jaw to keep your mouth from closing during surgical procedures. So this includes dentistry, of course, but also oral surgery and throat surgery. They've been used also to give anesthesia before surgeries. Originally, however, mouth gags were instruments used in torture. That's right. During the medieval period in Europe, after about 1200 AD, mouth gags were recognized as a legitimate torture tool. Yay! Some were used to keep the unfortunate victim's mouth closed so you couldn't speak, eat, or drink like those we see here. Others were designed to keep that mouth open for long periods, leading to jaw pain, an inability to speak, and an inability to swallow. So this is a version of the gag called the choke pear that forces the mouth open wider and wider as you turn the screw. Guess you couldn't really tell them to stop either. But the earliest known medical use for mouth gags was not until the late 1500s. Originally, they were intended to force the mouth open, especially in cases where the patient had tetanus or lockjaw, epilepsy, stroke, or they were in a coma. Not surprisingly, after they were first introduced, patients were afraid to open their mouths. Yeah. Eventually, this was no longer necessary once people finally got used to them. So a wide variety of different models of mouth gag have been invented. As you can see from our examples up here, some with or without tongue depressors, some are one-sided, some are double-sided, some are operated by spring-loaded ratchets or turn screws or a spring catch. The Whitehead mouth gag, which has been used since the 1870s, has an attached tongue depressor there in the middle and was adjusted by that ratchet there in the corner. So although it's still made today, the Whitehead gag needs support from a stand to keep it in place and keep the dentist's hands free. The Jennings mouth gag is also still used today. So unlike the Whitehead, it has a single ratchet on one side and can be operated by squeezing those handles together to close it and then depressing the ratchet to open it. It doesn't have a tongue depressor, as you can see, so maybe they used something else. The Jennings gag was actually created in St. Louis by Dr. John Ellis Jennings in 1914. And you'll notice that some of the other mouth gags look a bit different than those two. We have the Sluter-Jansen mouth gag. It's that fun little scissor-like one. That one has the curved arms designed to fit the face. So it's placed in the side of the mouth with the blades inside your cheeks, and then the ratchet locks it open. The Lane mouth gag with its central spring and sidebars, where they simply held the mouth widely open. So nothing terribly special about that, except it has spikes on the end where it fits to your cheeks. So whoever designed that clearly did not use it. The gag with the hinged top and bottom, which kind of looks like the little duck's bill, that one is generally called a mouth gap or a mouth prop. So that's held by the teeth and not the cheeks. That's also how our set there is, the Hare's Dental Mouth Prop and Mirrors from 1902. Dentist William Hare from Augusta, Illinois, invented this simple device to aid in tooth filling. So when it's held by the teeth, the reflective mirror surfaces of the prop reflect light into the tooth that's being worked on, so you have enough light to see by, which is pretty interesting. So in addition to holding the mouth open, it holds the lips, cheeks, and tongues away from the teeth and keeps moisture out. So although they're no longer created as a torture device, anyone who's experienced wearing one might say they are still, right? Yeah, I see some nods. Okay, so next we're going to move on to a different subject. So has anybody had the pleasure of wearing a mouth gag? You were nodding. Have you worn a mouth gag? Yes. Torture device still? Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Not exactly pleasant then, are they? No. So luckily, we're not in the medieval period anymore. They're not as bad, maybe? No? Not so much? Okay. That's fine. All right, so moving on. Let's talk a little bit about prosthetics, but a very specific kind, the ocular kind. These two boxes hold glass eye prostheses. So both boxes contain 50 different glass eyes or artificial eyes. The wooden set was made in New York about 1895, and the black leather box set was made around 1900. Each set contains eyes made of hand-blown glass with a variety of hand-painted standard iris colors and shades of the sclera, which is the whites of your eyes. So no, this isn't something that you would use to change your eye color every day. The sizes and the shapes vary as well because the set was made not to fit any one person. Sets like this were produced for a salesman or an ocularist to go and use to match to the patient's remaining eye for the best fit and for the best match. But these aren't actually really eyes as in eyeballs. They're only a shell made to cover the structures in the eye socket. But how does that work? How do you hold that in there? Well, if you lose an eye, due to injury or disease, there are two surgical methods to remove it: evisceration or enucleation. Evisceration is when that jelly-like inside of the eye is just scooped out or sucked out through an incision made in the front of the eye. Doesn't that sound fun? With this method, the outer eye and the eye socket tissues are preserved, so you still have part of that eye there. Enucleation is when the entire globe-like eyeball is cut out and removed from the eye socket. So the optic nerve is severed, but the muscles around the eye remain. After the eye is removed, an ocular implant like these Kaylee is going to show us are surgically embedded deep in the eye socket. The implant is typically a hard round device wrapped in living tissue or synthetic material, but we have different variations here since the design has changed over time. The implant takes the place of the eyeball after enucleation, or it's inserted into that empty globe that's left after evisceration. These implants were made by Mager and Gugelman of St. Louis, a company who specialized in fabricating ocular prosthesis since the 1920s. So the implant serves as the attachment point for that artificial eye. Not only does it benefit the patient's physical appearance and self-esteem, but using an ocular implant and prosthesis also prevent that eye socket from tissues from growing to fill the eye, fill that empty space. So the art of making artificial eyes has been practiced for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptian priests made the first ocular prosthesis called ecblepharins as early as the 5th century BC. So these were made out of enameled metal or painted clay and then attached to a cloth which was worn outside the socket. But archaeologists have found mummies with clay eyes inside the sockets, which is really cool, but they were likely placed there after death and not used in life. The first known in-socket artificial eyes were not made until the 15th century. So a ball either made of gold or coated in gold, like on our friend here, was inserted into the empty socket and then attached to a stump of the remaining tissue. Then the ball was colored with enamel to give it the appearance of the eye. In the latter part of the 16th century, Venetian glass makers discovered a formula for glass that actually could be tolerated inside the eye socket. But as you can maybe imagine, these early eyes were crude and not very comfortable and very fragile. So imagine getting ouch. But in the 18th and 19th century, French and German craftsmen perfected glass eye techniques, creating excellent optical glass. During World War I, the German Empire, who at the time was making the most amount of glass and the best glass to make artificial eyes, stopped supplying it to the US. So by 1917, the US War Department turned to American glass makers to manufacture optical glass and end the glass shortage. German glass exports stopped again during World War II, so the US government commissioned American companies to develop artificial eyes from a new material, plastic. Mager and Gugelman of St. Louis also made this set of plastic artificial eyes. Plastic is a more lightweight material than glass, less irritating to the eye socket, shatter resistant, making it ideal for use as artificial eyes. So since then, plastic has become the material of choice when making those artificial prostheses. Ooh, yay. Look at those. Aren't they beautiful? All right. Now we're going to turn to our next topics. Okay, so now we're at threat level orange. Okay, that was yellow. We've escalated to orange. So we're going to go a little bit more on depth on these final topics and explore some surgical procedures that are a little bit more unsettling. We're ramping up that gruesome level, so please be aware that the following descriptions and images may be more disturbing than what we've seen so far. Yay! All right. Does anyone have a headache? No? Anybody? Anyone? No? You? Ooh, good. I think we have something that can help with that. Yeah. How about trephination? Huh? Anybody ever heard of trephination or tree panning? Ooh, I see some hands. Yay. Okay, trepanation is a surgical procedure where the hole is cut or drilled into the human skull and a circular section of bone removed. Ooh, I'm sorry about that. There we go. That's better, kind of. Trepanation relieves pressure on the brain and over time was often used to treat various health problems like brain diseases, epileptic seizures, migraines, brain swelling, compression of the skull, melancholy, if anybody's sad, we can help, and mental disorders. Trepanation is actually the oldest surgical procedure known to man. In the last 150 years, thousands of trephine skulls have been found in widespread locations around the world in sites dating from the Neolithic period around 6500 BC all the way up into the 19th century. This includes sites in France, China, Russia, Greece, Peru, Mesoamerica, and Europe. What this tells us is that trepanation has been practiced by many different cultures around the world for thousands of years. So, here we have some really fun examples of trepanation instruments. So first we have this group of ancient surgical instruments, and although they're reproductions that were meant for display in a doctor's office, these tools accurately represent the real thing. So first we have our 1700 BC bronze scalpel from Babylon. Then we have our Egyptian tumor knife from 1300 BC, an 18th century European trepanation drill there in the center, and a Peruvian trepanation hatchet from 1200 AD. So let's talk a bit about the Peruvians. Archaeological evidence indicates that the Inca of Peru performed the most trepanations in history that we know of. Hundreds of skulls, both adults and children, have been found. In fact, the first evidence of trepan skulls comes from Peru, which was found in 1865. So a skull from an Incan burial ground was found with a hole roughly the size of a half-inch square cut out. So this is an illustration of that very skull. This was not an accidental hole either. This was the result of trepanation. So here we have an image of a lithograph from a set in our collections called The History of Medicine in Pictures. And this depicts the trepanation procedure being performed by the Inca in the 1st century AD. So of course it's an artist, rendering. But the surgeon is using a hatchet just like that one in our set to cut into the skull. But that hatchet has a name. It's called a tumi. And it is the curved metal knife preferred by the Inca to cut through the skin and the pericranium. The tumi is made of copper, and it dates to about 500 AD. The tumi blade was rubbed back and forth along the surface of the skull, creating those 4 incisions in a crisscross pattern, which is what we saw on the skull from 1865. Once those incisions were deep enough, the square-shaped piece of bone was levered out with a tool similar to this trepanation elevator. So this one is made of wrought iron, and it likely dates to the late medieval or early Renaissance period. And yes, it's not the exact tool used by the Inca, but trepanation instruments found at various archaeological sites provide us a reference point and show us that the tools didn't change much over time. It also shows how different cultures created similar tools for the procedures, even though they were oceans apart. So another example is our French trepanation set from St. Louis, which dates to between 1750 and 1800. Isn't it pretty? It's very pretty. So elevators, thank you, Kayla, like the one we just saw, are included in this. It has all the essential tools. So elevators, like we just saw, for levering out those pieces of bone. Perforators for making those pinpoint little holes in the skull or the tissue. Knives for doing what knives do. The brace drill and surgical drill crowns of different sizes. So those are the little saw ends. That's what actually went into the skull. And then we have the flat-headed lenticulars, and those were used to depress the exposed brain and then smooth out those bone edges. Then, of course, we need a bone brush so we can, get away the dust before we actually cut through the dura, which is that outer brain covering. and our colored suture silk to then close up the wound when we're done. But don't forget, the piece of bone did not go back in. So, trephination was frequently practiced in America too during the 1800s. The instrument called a trephine was the preferred tool. The brass one there. A trephine is the saw that cuts that circular hole in the skull. Now, the trephines were hand operated. So this sucker was turned by hand, and then as you drilled down into the patient's skull. Can you imagine hearing the crunch of bone as this happened? Because you would have been awake. Yeah. No? Okay. The trephines with the smooth saw there have an end that's known as a crown type cutting head. So those are the same width all the way down. And this was used primarily between the 1830s and the 1850s. But in 1860, a new variant of trephine was introduced, and this is called Galt's trephine. This had a conical cutting head, so it went down into a smaller width at the bottom, with spiral teeth that helped prevent the trephine from cutting into the brain once through the skull, because we don't want to do that, and made it easier to remove the bone. So did you happen to notice some of the spikes there on those trephines? Yeah? Okay, so those were used to start the procedure, kind of like a starting mark, right? You mark it with the little, and then you know where to go, and keep the blade in place while cutting. As you can see from this image, the skull has those marks. So trephines, they all look kind of similar, don't they? Somewhat? Well, the design of the instrument has not changed too much over time. So nearly 100 years separates the Civil War Galt trephine from the surgical steel hand drill set from 1966, which is there at the bottom right. Other one, Kalia. That side. Yep. See, they all look so similar. The same is true for then that brace trephine set from 1928, which is like the earlier one we have in our trephination set. But the brace trephine there has changeable surgical burrs. So those are the saws. But they're a lot smaller than the ones we saw from the earlier sets. That's nice. Smaller is better in this case. Yes. The longer 16-inch surgical drill is kind of an anomaly, but it makes me think that maybe the surgeon was like, ooh, I need to get a little bit away from the action that's happening down there. That's how I would feel anyway. So this and other saws, other than the trephine, were used for trephination as well. So we have 3 tools that are called Hayes saw. They're all the same saw, but different variations. So they've got both a straight edge for cutting and then that rounded toothed edge. So as you can probably imagine, this maybe took a lot longer to cut with a Hayes saw than it did with the trephine. And it was actually used in much the same way as the Toomey knife. So we also have examples of the surgical chainsaw. Yay, chainsaws. Did you know that chainsaw was originally invented to aid in childbirth? Anybody know that? Yeah. So 2 Scottish doctors in 1780 invented the first chainsaw for use during obstructed labor to cut the mother's pelvic bones and widen the birth canal. I know, sounds like a good time. The original design was much like this one here at the top, with that fine serrated link chain held between 2 wooden handles. So although the thought of a chainsaw being used during childbirth is absolutely terrifying, the invention did save many lives. So soon after its creation, doctors began using the chainsaw for other types of surgeries like trephination because it was quick to use and made very clean, precise cuts. So 2 holes were made in the area to be cut, then the chain was passed through and the handles attached. Then the surgeon worked that chain back and forth. Maybe he did it to a little song. So to cut that skull piece, and then that piece was removed. About 1894, an Italian surgeon developed what he called the giggly saw after himself, and it's the twisted wire version that we have on the bottom there, and it was much more effective. So the giggly saw eventually replaced that toothed chainsaw and was commonly used to perform amputations and to remove portions of diseased bones. In 1905, 10 years after the Giggly Saw, another inventor realized that the chainsaw could cut through redwood trees much better than it could bones. Oh my goodness. So Samuel Benz filed a patent in 1905 for what we would recognize today as the first modern chainsaw used in carpentry, woodworking, all that fun stuff. You can thank women for the chainsaw. Yes, yes. All right, so now to our final topic. It's threat level red, all right? This is where it gets grosser. More gross? Worse. It's just worse. So this is the highest level we'll get tonight, appropriately for our last subject. That way you can hit the bathroom on the way out if you need to. If anybody needs a bag, let one of your, let someone know. So if you're squeamish, please be aware that there will be graphic images and descriptions. Do we think we're ready for this? Oh, goody. Okay. All right. Before the Civil War, few American doctors had extensive surgical experience. Many doctors got their first introduction to surgery on the Civil War battlefields. More than 12,000 physicians and 5,500 civilian surgeons served during the war and developed their surgical skills while under fire. Neither army was prepared for the overwhelming number of wounded, in part because of one invention. The mini ball, invented in 1849, was prominently used by both sides, and it caused terrific damage. With the capability to kill up to a half a mile away, this increased range and improved accuracy of the rifle and mini ball combo are thought to account for around 90% of casualties in the war. And remember, casualties are dead and wounded. So the mini ball was a large, heavy bullet that moved at rather a slow speed. Instead of iron, this soft lead bullet expanded upon impact, causing large gaping holes, splintered bones, and destroying muscles, arteries, and tissues beyond possible repair. It didn't just break bones, it shattered them. And it didn't just pierce tissue and internal organs, it shredded them. And if you were lucky and the bullet actually exited the body, it tore an exit wound several times larger than the entrance wound. So these images show wounds caused by the mini ball to some unfortunate Civil War soldiers. And yes, these are real images from the Civil War. So if you look at the bullets that Kaylee's has, that we have here, those are our mini balls. Some still retain their shape, and that means they're very likely dropped during battle and were never used. So as you can imagine, this happened quite often as soldiers were in the heat of battle and you're freaking out and you're just dropping them as you're trying to load your rifle or reload your rifle. The others that we have are clearly had impacted something, hopefully rocks, which you can see from the mushroom shape or that irregular shape. So that's what happened when those bullets impact something. Now, it may look maybe a little bit harmless, but they caused unprecedented damage. Probably not surprising, those shot with a mini ball through the torso or the head were not expected to live. Just look at the damage to those two skulls. It is absolutely terrifying. But of the wounds recorded in the Civil War, more than 70% were to the extremities or the limbs. So this forced surgeons to perform an increasing number of amputations, and soon they became all too familiar with using these particular sets of tools, these surgical amputation sets. So this set closest to me with the red velvet is from about 1800, and then the set next to that is from the Civil War, about 1860. Amputation was the most common operation of the Civil War surgeon. Out of approximately 60,000 documented surgeries, about 3/4 of all the operations performed during the war were amputations. It was a common sight to see piles of amputated limbs outside the field surgeon's tent. And yes, this is a real photo taken from 64, excuse me. Surgeons did not amputate as first choice, though. They tried to preserve the limbs. However, if the injury was too severe, or if the wound became infected and gangrene set in, as we can see in these examples, the limb had to be sacrificed to save the life. Infections were common, but the chances of surviving amputation were actually pretty good, more than 70%. Surgeons quickly became skilled at performing amputations. In many cases, an amputation could be performed in under 10 minutes. Yeah, 10 minutes. So let's take a little closer look at some of these surgeons' amputation tools and talk about the amputation procedure. So during an amputation, first the surgeon would apply a tourniquet to help reduce blood loss. Then a scalpel was used to make shallow, precise cuts through the skin. And then next, a long, sharp, double-sided Catlin knife or single-sided Liston knife was used to quickly slice through the muscle and expose the bone. So fun story about the Liston knife. It was named after Scottish surgeon Robert Liston, Scots again, who earned the reputation as the fastest surgeon of his time in the early 1800s. In one case, he performed an amputation in less than 30 seconds. Said, "Time me, fellas," and went at it. So admirably, he wanted his surgical procedures to be quick and limit the amount of pain that a patient would suffer. And he knew also that speed could make the difference between life and death. Unfortunately, that does present opportunity for mistakes, maybe. He's also known for accidentally amputating a patient's testicle in addition to his leg. Whoops. And one of his procedures had a 300% mortality rate. 300%. Should be impossible. Should be impossible, right? So let me explain. A spectator watching the surgery dropped dead from shock after being slashed with Liston's surgical knife. He was probably too close. Yeah. Then Liston's assistant died from an infection after part of his hand was accidentally cut off. So he was just going at it. And finally, the patient, because we can't forget about the patient, right? He ended up dying after developing gangrene at the amputation site. So that's how you get 300% mortality rate, and not something you want to be known for, right? Yeah, not visiting that surgeon. Despite those disastrous events, Liston was an innovative surgeon and revolutionized the amputation process. He was the first to cut and leave flaps of skin so that the stump could be completely covered and have a better chance at healing. And the amputation knives that he developed made the surgeon's cut faster and easier, causing less pain to the patient. Knives used for amputations during the 18th century were typically curved before this because surgeons tended to make a circular cut through the skin and the muscle before cutting into the bone. But straight knives like Liston's became popular and soon replaced the curved knife for standard use. Back to our amputation tools. After cutting through the muscle, the surgeon grabbed his bone saw and sawed all the way through the bone. You ever heard the term sawbones? This is why. For larger bones like the femur, we have our capital bone saw. In this crumb example that we have from the early 1900s and the example from our Civil War set, so they're the type of saw that was invented and became popular during the Civil War. Previously, the more elaborate bow saws, like the one in our older set, were used. But all those pretty little crevices and the decorated frame and the non-metallic handle proved to be breeding ground for germs. Yay. The other example, our smaller metal carpal saw, was used for smaller bones, like fingers. So after using the necessary saw and the limb was detached, the surgeon chucked it out, used hooks to pull out and tie off arteries, and scraped the edges of the bone smooth with a bone file, like Kalia has. So they could also use bone cutting forceps, which would be used to finish cuts or trim those bone fragments. And as you can imagine, those are very sharp. And then grasping forceps were also used to remove bone pieces and extract bullets or other matter from the wound. But sometimes something a little more heavy duty might be necessary, like our bone mallet and the straight edge chisel and that curved angular gouge. Oh, yay, look at those. Don't those look fun? So those would be needed to scrape and shape the bone ends. Now, maybe a bone mallet seems a bit extreme, but contrary to popular belief, bones are not that easy to break, okay? Bones are incredibly strong, and ounce for ounce are stronger than steel. 1 cubic inch of bone, 1 cubic inch, can withstand the weight of 5 standard pickup trucks, give or take a few pounds. So the last step in the amputation procedure was then to sew the muscles and tissue over the end of the stump with a needle and sutures. Afterward, the patient was moved out from the operating table. The surgeon moved on to the next patient in the never-ending line of wounded men. So unfortunately, that procedure is still necessary today, and it hasn't changed very much, but thankfully we have a lot better tools and anesthesia. That's right. Yay, we don't have to be awake for that and hope we pass out. Okay, so that is all that I have for you this evening. I hope that you have enjoyed this wonderfully creepy presentation and some of these objects. And that you've learned a little bit of something and some fun things. You can tell people about 300% mortality rates, right? That's a fun fact for a party. All right. Now, if anybody has a question, please go ahead and raise your hands, and one of our members, Lizzie, will come around with a microphone. Anybody have a question? Wow. Really? Okay. Wow. Yes, mainly to relieve pressure on the brain. So that was one of the earliest intended uses. But as I said, relieving pressure. If a bone piece had gotten into the skull, was punched in or broken in, then that was used to remove that piece. If you were sad, this would help. But reasons like that. So mental disorders and other reasons. Yeah, so that was just for fun, not real. Although there was a time when some of the surgeons practicing used it to help remove the demons. So if we think of our medieval friends and our very religious beliefs at that time, they thought that that was one way to get rid of them. Yeah. Make a hole and then they come out. I guess that's how that works. Yes? Burr holes? Well, possibly. In what context do you mean burr holes?
So burr holes are when a neurosurgeon will drill into a skull to release pressure on the brain.
Okay, yes. And here we go. These are actually surgical burrs. So trephination has evolved to become craniotomy. And so craniotomy is a similar thing, but instead of just blindly going in there and making holes in the skull until you find what's wrong, you have an MRI or a scan to make sure you know where to go. But yes, these are called burrs, and that's what they use today.
And one more question followed up that. Is that also what led to eventually how they did lobotomies?
Lobotomies are different. So lobotomies are also a way they thought to help with some mental disorders, but not the same. So you would have a sharp tool, a very sharp needle, a sharp pick, and that would go in through the eye because you were aiming for a very, Lizzie, I'm sorry. You would aim for a very particular part of the brain that they believed was the seat of these mental disorders. So that was different and awful to think about, that you see that coming towards you. So, ooh, maybe. Lizzie thinks so. Anyone else have a question? Yes, Alyssa? That's my daughter. Hello.
At the beginning, you talked about the choke pear. Is that similar to the pear of anguish? Because they kind of look the same.
Yes, child. I'm so pleased you know that. Yeah. Yes, that is correct. If anyone has heard of the pear of anguish, another medieval torture tool, this is the very similar thing, but for your mouth instead of other places. Yes. We're going to talk later, you and I. Anyway, anyone else have a question? Please. Okay. Well, if you have no other questions, thank you so much for coming out tonight. We are going to move the tables up to the front of the stage, and you are welcome to come up and take a closer look.